Hey there, A-Pushers. It's time for episode 2 of our series on foreign policy during Franklin Delano Roosevelt's administration prior to World War II. In our last episode, we looked at how the U.S. was reluctant to get involved internationally as it recovered from the Great Depression. We talked about how the United States did not participate in an international convention to stabilize currencies, how it reduced its responsibilities overseas by giving the Philippines its independence and creating a good neighbor policy with Latin America to avoid military intervention. We also talked about how the Roosevelt administration focused on improving trade relationships with the new Soviet government, as well as reducing tariffs and trade obstacles with the international community in hopes that economic recovery would take place. As far as the affairs of Europe were concerned, the United States wanted nothing to do with that, and we ended our discussion yesterday talking about how the neutrality acts between 1936 and 1939 really didn't distinguish between enemy and ally. It's only with the Neutrality Act of 1939 do we see the United States take a step towards involving itself in the military affairs of our allies when we pass the cash and carry policies that will allow nations like Great Britain to purchase weapons on a cash-only basis from the United States, and with the promise that they will then transport those weapons themselves back to the war zone. The United States is not going to get involved. It fears the experiences that it had that drew it into World War I, and we set strict laws that prevent American involvement in World War II. Where we ended yesterday then was with the appeasement of Adolf Hitler, and that the United States and the rest of the international community sort of watched on as Hitler took control of Austria, Czechoslovakia, the neutral border region between Germany and France, known as the Rhineland, and only paused for a collective breath when Germany finally invaded Poland. France and Britain declared war against Germany at that point, and we are then in the starting phases of World War II proper. Now, the time between the invasion of Poland and the actual violence that follows the invasion of France is known as the Phony War. And really what we're seeing here is a lot of pivoting and positioning of Europe's major armies. So, for example, the Germans very quickly invade Norway and Sweden to their northeast, and they invade Belgium and the Netherlands to their west as they poised their tanks and men to drive a stake into the heart of Paris. In this picture that we have on the screen right now, it's Hitler touring Paris. You can see the Eiffel Tower in the background. Hitler's strategy for taking over territory in Europe using mechanized warfare, using tanks and vehicles that allow his forces to strike lightning quick, is known as the Blitzkrieg. And so it seems like just a matter of months, and Hitler has claimed the majority of territory in Northern Europe using this Blitzkrieg tactic. With the capitulation of France, the one remaining nation that is a democracy is Great Britain. And in 1940, we start to see Hitler preparing his Luftwaffe, his new modern air force, to strike at Great Britain. It was only after the fall of Paris and the beginning of the Battle of Britain that the United States stopped to take inventory of its own military strength, realizing that for the last decade and a half, it had been reducing armaments and that it was incredibly underprepared to deal with a potential threat from Adolf Hitler, Congress appropriated $37 billion in the early days of 1940. This is going to be something that is added on top of the already ballooning deficit that the New Deal project had created. But in this action, we see the United States begin its wartime production and creating a whole wave of new employment opportunities for those people that worked in factories that would create war material. Additionally, Congress stepped up its wartime production by passing America's first draft. Technically, the United States was still in a state of neutrality and peacetime, but this legislation would create a new reserve of American forces with 1.2 million troops, with 800,000 men in reserve. By the summer of 1940, Hitler was launching an all-out assault using his Luftwaffe against the island nation of Great Britain. The intention was to prepare for a naval invasion of Great Britain to be followed at the end of the summer. However, the Battle of Britain raged on for months as the Royal Air Force tenaciously defended their country. Eventually, Hitler decided to postpone the naval invasion of Great Britain indefinitely, but this particular conflict leads the American people to reignite the debate over whether or not the United States should support Great Britain in its defense of democracy. Americans tuned in every day to listen to British radio broadcasting of the Nazi night raids taking place against their home country. This is a patriotic poster that was put out by the Committee to Defend America by aiding the Allies. And really what transpires out of America's investment in listening to what is happening to Great Britain in this air war is people start to consider how if Britain were to fall, there would be nothing standing in between the United States and the rise of Nazism. One group that was particularly active in promoting the defense of Great Britain was the Committee to Defend America by Aiding the Allies, or CDAAA. They appealed to both interventionists and isolationists. To those that would support intervention, they used propaganda slogans such as "Britain is fighting our fight." To isolationists, they appealed for assistance by encouraging all methods short of war. So conflict would be kept away from the homeland by supporting Britain. As the Americans debated whether or not to involve themselves further in the issues of Europe, Roosevelt did what he could to support the British. On September 2nd, 1940, through an executive action, Roosevelt agreed to trade 50 World War I destroyer ships in exchange for 8 valuable naval bases that stretched along the Atlantic coast of the United States from the Netherlands down to South America. This agreement was legally questionable since it was a presidential agreement and not passed by Congress, as is required in an authentic declaration of war. It certainly was not a neutral act, but public opinion was starting to move in the direction of supporting Britain by all means short of war. 1940 continued to be a time filled with political obstacles to supporting intervention in Europe for FDR. In fact, it was an election year. FDR was challenged by Republican Wendell Willkie of Indiana, who was nominated at the Philadelphia Convention on a platform that condemned FDR's alleged dictatorship and tactics of New Deal policies. While Wilkie may have been able to defeat FDR if he had come out as a staunch isolationist, both candidates seem to share a mutual foreign policy. FDR and Wilkie both promised to stay out of the war. They promised to continue to strengthen the nation's defenses, yet both recognized the importance of Great Britain in defending the free world from totalitarianism. Roosevelt was elected to his third term in office with less of a walkaway victory than he had in 1932 and 1936. Over 27 million citizens voted in favor of Roosevelt, while 22 million supported Wilkie. Ultimately, the electoral count was a lopsided victory for Roosevelt, with 449 delegates voting for the Democratic incumbent and 82, mostly from the Midwest, supporting Wilkie. The end of the political cycle of 1940 couldn't have come soon enough for the British, who had rapidly run out of cash reserves in order to purchase weapons from the United States on a cash and carry basis. Roosevelt now turned his attention towards another step that would help our democratic allies in Europe wage war against Adolf Hitler. Through the Lend-Lease Bill, also known as an act further to promote the defense of the United States, Roosevelt championed the idea that America would act as the arsenal of democracy, meaning that while we would spare our sons, we would provide our democratic allies with guns. This would allow Great Britain to borrow American munitions for the duration of the war and ultimately return them or replace them with the war's end. Roosevelt likened this scenario to lending your neighbor a garden hose to help put a fire out in his own home. One wouldn't question what condition the garden hose was in after the fire was put out, but good neighbors would be responsible for replacing the garden hose if it were too badly damaged. Isolationists, though, argued that the Lend-Lease Act was more like handing over someone your chewing gum and expecting them to return it once they were finished consuming it. Nevertheless, the bill was approved March 1941 by a sweeping majority in both the House and the Senate. This image is of members of the Mothers Crusade, which was a political action group that was in opposition to the Lend-Lease Act and military intervention in Europe in general. These women came to the Capitol to plead with Congress to destroy the Lend-Lease law. They feared that America's increasing involvement in the Allied cause would eventually draw their sons into battle, as it did, despite the president's assurances that the Lend-Lease law would result in billions of dollars to the effort and not bodies. The Lend-Lease Act was one of the most monumentous laws ever passed by Congress. By 1945, America had sent $50 billion worth of arms and equipment to our allies fighting the world's aggressors. Passing the Lend-Lease Act was an economic declaration of war, and a shooting war was soon to follow. While the president had touted the Lend-Lease Act as America's responsibility to be the arsenal of democracy, it didn't take long before all allies were lent and leased equipment. Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union on June 1941 resulted in an unsuspected alliance. America quickly delivered aid to Moscow, sending over $1 billion of military supplies and equipment to the Soviet Union. This would be a down payment on the $11 billion that we would ultimately give to our communist counterparts. Russian valor and Russian winter ultimately halted Hitler's invasion and changed the course of the war. Furthermore, the Lend-Lease Act geared U.S. factories for all-out war production. We'll be talking about America's efforts on the home front during World War II in our next lecture, but this enormously increased the capacity for America's ability to defend itself as well as to to hit the ground running when shooting started. It was also clearly a turning point in the relationships between the United States and Germany. Hitler recognized the Lend-Lease law as an unofficial declaration of war. On May 21st, 1941, Germany attacked the unarmed American merchant ship, the Robin Moore, torpedoing and damaging it, but not sinking it to the bottom. In Hitler's mind, it was no longer necessary to try to curry favor with the United States. Britain did not have enough destroyers to chaperone arms across the Atlantic Ocean. And with Germany no longer respecting American naval rights, it was of little use to go on with the policy of the cash and carry laws that required Britain to come pick its equipment up. Roosevelt made the fateful decision on July 1941 to help the British shepherd munitions across the Atlantic to a meeting point outside of Ireland. There, the British would take the U.S. arms and escort them the rest of the way into the battle zone. In September of 1941, the U.S. destroyer Greer was attacked by a German sub that had been trailing without damage to either side's forces. Roosevelt proclaimed after this incident with the Greer that American Navy could shoot on sight any German submarine that threatened the ship's existence. In October, the USS Kearney was engaged in battle by German U-boats. It lost 11 crew members and was crippled but not sunk. 2 weeks later, the USS Reuben James was torpedoed and sunk off the southwestern coast of Iceland. It lost more than 100 officers and enlisted men. With the Lend-Lease Act in full swing and the threat of German U-boats a reality for American merchant vessels as well as the U.S. Navy, President Roosevelt met with the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Winston Churchill, in August of 1941. They met aboard a ship off the coast of Newfoundland in the Atlantic Ocean. This became the first of a series of important meetings between these two world leaders. This particular incident is known as the Atlantic Conference, and out of this, the two nations forged a new charter that many historians relate to the 14 points that Wilson had inaugurated World War I with a generation before. Like the 14 points, the Atlantic Charter argued for the rights of individuals rather than nations. It laid the groundwork for the later advocacy of universal human rights. It opposed imperialistic annexations of new territories and insisted that no territorial changes would take place that were contrary to the wishes of the people that lived there. In other words, just like the 14 points, the Atlantic Charter championed self-determination. It affirmed the rights of people to choose their own form of government, even if those territories had been taken control of by dictatorships. In particular, the governments that had been befallen by dictatorships like Poland would be allowed to participate in the creation of new democracies once the war had finished. The charter also included plans for disarmament following the war's end and a peacetime security through an international negotiating body that would act as a new League of Nations. Looking forward, that body would become the United Nations. While the Atlantic Charter and Roosevelt's interactions with Churchill would be condemned by isolationists as hostile, provocative actions, such critics miss the point. The United States was no longer neutral. The attitudes of Congress and the general public were moving in the direction of support for our British counterpart. In November of 1941, Congress repealed the Neutrality Act of 1939. In addition to being escorted by the U.S. Navy, merchant ships were now allowed to arm themselves and prepare for wholesale attacks by Hitler's submarines. This is a photograph of FDR next to Winston Churchill in the blue blazer to the right, his right. But it would not be in the Atlantic, but the Pacific, where America would be inaugurated into the wholesale violence of World War II. Now, it shouldn't be a surprise that Japan attacked the United States, as it had been a military ally of Nazi Germany since September of 1940. Japan had been mired down in the costly and exhausting conquest of China and felt that its best options to continue its nationalistic expansion rested in an alliance with Adolf Hitler. But this came at the expense of its trade relationship with the United States. By allying with Hitler during a time where escalation of conflict between the US and Germany was growing, Japan and US relations turned icy. Japan was fatally dependent on the immense shipment of steel and scrap iron, oil, and aviation gasoline that the United States offered it. Such assistance to the Japanese was highly unpopular in America, and Roosevelt moved to embargo the Japanese-bound supplies in the summer of 1940. By the middle of 1941, the United States had also frozen Japanese financial assets in American banks. It had imposed a cessation of shipments of gasoline and oil to the desperate armies of Japan. 1941 was marked by tense negotiations between the US and Japan, especially in the later months of November and December. The US State Department insisted that Japan leave China before its trade relationship with the United States could continue. But Japan's imperialistic military leaders were unwilling to lose face by withdrawing from the Asian continent. Faced with either capitulating to American demands, they chose instead to swing the sword. Washington had cracked the code and learned that Tokyo had decided to go in the direction of war. No one in high authority in Washington, though, believed that the Japanese were strong enough or motivated enough to strike the U.S. naval base at Hawaii. Japan reinforced these notions by seeking to prolong peace negotiations, and at one point even offering friendship medals to the dignitaries of the U.S. government. December 7th, 1941, a Black Sunday, became a date which will live in infamy, as Roosevelt told Congress in his war address. Japanese bombers attacked Pearl Harbor without warning. Many aircraft were destroyed. The battleships of the U.S. fleet were virtually wiped out, as 8 were sunk entirely. Numerous small vessels were also damaged and destroyed, and about 3,000 casualties were inflicted on American personnel. The silver lining in this very dark cloud was that 3 American aircraft carriers were not at harbor during this assault and would be instrumental in the Pacific campaign waged later against Japan. This is a photograph of the battleship West Virginia. The shocking Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, propelled the United States into World War II. One of the first ships to be hit, the USS West Virginia, quickly sank in its moorings, taking at least 70 sailors down with it. By September 1944, the West Virginia had been repaired and was back in service. Angered, Congress the next day officially recognized war had been thrust on the United States. The Senate and the House issued a roll call vote where only one vote was cast against a declaration of war. Germany and Italy, allies to Japan, spared Congress further debate by declaring war against the United States on December 11, 1941. Unofficial war already for months was now official. But the attack on Pearl Harbor was paid off for Japan only in the short run. To the very day of the attack, a strong majority of Americans wanted to keep out of the war. But bombs on Pearl Harbor blasted away isolationists and their sentiments. Rather than let democracy die and dictatorships rule, most citizens have evidently determined to support a policy that might lead to war, and it did. In our next lecture, we'll be looking at America's efforts on the home front to prepare and wage war in both Europe and in the South Pacific against Japan.